In the Zagros Mountains, somewhere in what is now Iraq, a man is old, very old for his world. His left eye socket was crushed years ago, and he is blind in that eye. His right arm, withered and useless since childhood, hangs dead at his side. The bones of his spine are fusing together, and his ears, blocked by growths built up over a lifetime, carry almost no sound. Around him is a world full of things that should have killed him. Large carnivores, broken terrain, food that has to be hunted, fought for, torn apart. He cannot see half of it. He cannot hear it coming. He cannot fight it off. And yet, when archaeologists find his bones, tens of thousands of years later, they will find something remarkable. He did not die young. He lived to be somewhere between 35 and 50 years old. That should not be possible. And the only explanation is the one that quietly unsettles everyone who studies him. Somebody kept him alive.
So here is the question at the heart of this story. When did humans start taking care of their old? And what did that care look like? In a cave, in a village, and in the first empires on Earth? The easy answer, the one you have probably heard, is that this never happened at all. Ancient humans died at 30. Everything after that is modern luxury. It is a comforting story, and it is wrong. The confusion comes from a single brutal statistic. Life expectancy at birth in a prehistoric hunter-gatherer group was somewhere between 20 and 40 years. But that number is not describing a normal life. It is describing an average, and that average is being dragged down by the ground. More than 30% of children in those groups died before their first birthday. Childhood, not adulthood, was the killer. The infant mortality curve is not a gentle slope. It is a wall. Strip away the wall and the picture flips. For people who survived early childhood, the mortality curve is a J shape. It bottoms out near adulthood, then climbs slowly with age. Among foragers, about half of the people who reach 20 could expect to live to 60. 60. In a world without medicine, without agriculture, without written language. And on top of that, women routinely outlived their own fertility. Menopause is nearly unique to humans among all primates. An entire phase of life existed, decades long, with no evolutionary precedent. So the myth of dying at 30 hides the real story. The capacity for a long life has been with us from the very beginning. What is actually new, very new, is that growing old became common. About 30,000 years ago, something shifted. Paleoanthropologists study the pattern of tooth wear across an entire fossil population to measure the ratio of older adults to younger adults. For almost the whole fossil record, that ratio barely moved. Then, in the early Upper Paleolithic, among modern Homo sapiens, it suddenly jumped. For the first time in human history, 3 generations were alive at once. Old people stopped being the rare exception and became a fixture of the group. This was not a footnote. The explosion of older adults happened at exactly the same moment as an explosion of everything else.
Symbolic art, complex tools, trade in raw materials, social complexity. And it was not a coincidence. Anthropologists call it the grandmother hypothesis. Post-reproductive women, and older men, stopped competing with their own children for food. Instead, they gathered high-yield foods, processed complex resources, and fed their grandchildren directly. They were the first teachers, the first daycare. But their most important contribution could not be measured in calories. Elders were the group's living memory. A drought that happened once a decade, a mineral deposit that appeared once a generation, a tool-making sequence with a dozen steps that took a lifetime to learn. All of it was stored in minds that only survived past 50. Groups with elders could remember what other groups had forgotten. In a world of scarce resources, that was not a luxury. It was a competitive advantage, an edge that helped modern humans spread while other hominin populations faded. Old age, in other words, is not a modern invention. It is the engine that helped make us modern. But there was a catch. The world was about to get easier, and old age was about to get much, much harder. The agricultural revolution. 10,000 years ago, humans stopped hunting and started planting. It is sold as progress, the birth of civilization. And for the human skeleton, it was a catastrophe. Life expectancy at birth collapsed, from a hunter-gatherer range around 26 to 35 years down to between 19 and 25.
Dense settlements, packed together with domesticated animals, became breeding grounds for diseases that had never existed before. Crowd epidemics, zoonotic infections. The bones of early farmers carry the marks. Enamel defects from childhood malnutrition, iron deficiency anemia, and spines worn down by heavy, repetitive field labor. And the survivors carried a hidden tax. People who lived through the infections of childhood entered adulthood with chronically inflamed bodies, and chronic inflammation accelerates aging. Degenerative disease struck earlier. Old age, when it came harder. So civilization achieved something strange. It made survival into adulthood easier, and survival into real old age rarer and more painful. But scarcity changes value. The fewer elders there were, the more they were worth. And as groups grew into states, the care of the old stopped being an informal family matter and became law. But before the laws, before the states, we need to rewind. Because caring for the old is older than our species itself. The oldest evidence of it comes from Dromani in the Republic of Georgia, dated to roughly 1.8 million years ago. The skeleton belongs to a Homo erectus, a species that emerged long before modern humans. This individual was old for his time, and he had lost all but one of his teeth years before he died. His jawbones show it. The bone had reabsorbed, and deep infection had eaten into the maxilla and mandible. Think about what that means. A creature that could not chew. In a world where every meal required tearing and grinding, a toothless old man should have starved within weeks. He did not. The only way he survived is that other members of his group fed him, foraging for soft things like brains and marrow, or chewing and processing his food for him. They literally made his meals something he could swallow.
1.8 million years ago, a species that is not us, carrying an elder who could not feed himself. Caring for the old is not something we invented. It is written into who we are. Which brings us back to the man in the Zagros Mountains. The Shanidar I Neanderthal, discovered in a cave in Iraq, dating to around 60,000 years ago, lived to be 35 to 50. That alone is not exceptional. What is exceptional is everything he survived to get there. A crushing blow to his left eye socket that almost certainly blinded him in that eye. A right forearm and hand that were amputated or withered since childhood. Degenerative disease in his spine and hips. And in both ear canals, growth so severe they gave him advanced hearing loss. A partially blind, one-armed, hard-of-hearing man with a failing spine in a world of large carnivores. He did not survive because he was strong. He survived because the people around him were. They shared their food. They protected him. They slowed the group's movements to keep him with them. We do not know how they did it. There are no letters, no records, no voices. But the bones are evidence enough.
Somewhere in the late Pleistocene, in a cave in the Zagros, a community decided its old man was worth carrying. That same decision, the worth of an elder, is the thread that runs from a cave in Georgia to a cave in Iraq, and forward, all the way to the first empires. And in those empires, for the first time, it was written down. In ancient Egypt, around 2400 BCE, a vizier named Ptahhotep, an old man nearing the end of a long career, writes to his king, asking permission to retire. His description of old age is unsparing. Feebleness arrives, he says. The eyes grow dim, the ears grow deaf. Strength drains away with weariness. The heart no longer remembers the past. Sitting and standing are painful. But Ptahhotep is not asking to be discarded. He asks for something far more sophisticated, a staff of old age. A younger man, his son, appointed to carry the heavy work of the office. And here is the key. Ptahhotep keeps his title, his income, his judicial authority. He delegates the labor to someone younger, while remaining officially above him. The Egyptian state had invented something we still use, retirement without exile. The elder's body fails, but his status does not, and the state is protected from losing his accumulated knowledge all at once. 2,000 years later, and half a world away, the Han Dynasty of China turned the same instinct into machinery. In Han China, Filial piety was not a private virtue. It was imperial policy, engineered into law. When a citizen reached 70, they were presented with the gaozhang, an imperial walking staff, topped with a carved pigeon. The pigeon was a symbol of health and good digestion, but the staff itself was a legal passport. Its holder could not be arbitrarily arrested, could not be flogged, could not be insulted by junior officials or commoners.
The staff made an elder's body untouchable in the eyes of the state. And the state did not stop at the elder. Households that cared for their old were exempted from labor service and from grain taxes. The family that kept its elders was effectively paid by the empire. And at seasonal festivals, officials distributed meat, wine, and grain to the elderly themselves. A long life, guaranteed by tax law. Filial piety as national policy. The cave in the Zagros had become a bureaucracy. The Romans pushed this further and ran into the wall that every gerontocracy eventually hits. Rome was a society built on reverence for age. The Senate takes its name from senex, old man. The paterfamilias held legal power over his descendants until the day he died. Old age was the default seat of power. And yet, the Romans had a proverb that sounds like something out of a horror story. Sexagenarios de ponte desere. Throw the 60-year-olds off the bridge. For centuries, antiquarians took it literally, a lingering ritual of human sacrifice, old men thrown into the river. It was not.
Modern analysis shows the proverb referred to a specific voting procedure. In the Comitia Centuriata, Rome's great voting assembly, citizens over 60 stopped crossing the narrow wooden gangways, the pontes, that led to the ballot. The purpose was not to kill the old. It was to make sure the old did not control everything. The military-age citizens, the iuniores, kept the dominant voice in the state's most important votes. Seniors kept their power at home and their prestige in the Senate, but at the ballot box, the future got to vote. Rome had found the flaw in its own devotion to age. A society that lets the old decide everything eventually decides nothing new. The bridge was the first answer to a question we are still asking. How do you respect your elders without letting them own the present? And in the streets of the same city, the philosophers were fighting over the same question, in human terms. What does old age do to a mind? In Plato's Republic, the elderly Cephalus insists that aging is a relief. As the body's appetites fade, he says, the soul is finally freed to think. Aristotle, in his Rhetoric, offers the opposite verdict, drawn from observation. Decades of reversals and betrayals have made old men cynical, distrustful, small-minded, acting always out of self-interest. And Diogenes the cynic, in his threadbare cloak, carrying a wooden staff, rejected the entire game. Drop the status, the wealth, the conventions. True old age, he said, is living according to nature, not according to the city. Peace, cynicism, escape. 3 ancient answers to a question that still has not stopped being asked.
So what did ancient humans do when they got old? They were fed, at Dromani, by hands that processed their food for them. They were carried, in the Zagros mountains, by a community that slowed its own pace for a man who could barely see or hear. They were honored by a Chinese emperor's staff that made an old body untouchable. They were retired, without being exiled, by a vizier in Egypt who kept his authority to his last day. And they were checked at the ballot box in Rome when their grip on power grew too heavy. The one thing they were never asked to do was disappear. Growing old has never been a passive fate. For 1.8 million years, it has been an active project, a decision repeated in every generation that an elder's memory and knowledge, and the elder themselves, were worth the cost of carrying them. From a toothless man in Georgia to a pigeon-topped staff in China, the answer to what ancient humans did when they got old has never really been about the old at all. It has been about everyone else. The question was never whether humans could grow old. It was always whether we would take care of the ones who did.